Have you ever wondered how far back your family tree goes? Go back 1,000 years, then 10,000, then 30,000, and at some point, you realize something unsettling. You are not here simply because your ancestors had a lot of children. In fact, the opposite is closer to the truth. You are here because generation after generation, your ancestors were among the few children who did not die young, did not starve, and did not disappear on a long migration route. Today, we usually think of having children as a family decision. When to get married, when to try for a baby, one child or two, maybe a second child later. But in the prehistoric world, childbirth was not family planning. It was a long survival gamble. There were no hospitals, no antibiotics, no vaccines, no infant formula, no clean tap water, and no modern birth control. A child being born was not the beginning of a safe life. It was only level 1. So here is the question. In a world like that, how many children would a prehistoric woman have in her lifetime? Most people would guess, a lot. Maybe 10, maybe 15. After all, if there was no modern birth control, wouldn't people just keep having babies? And if many children died young, wouldn't it make sense to have even more of them? That sounds logical, but it is probably wrong. If we are talking about Paleolithic hunter-gatherers, a reasonable estimate is this. A woman may have had around 5 to 6 children over her lifetime, not 15 or 16. Around 5 to 6, and that is only the number of children born. The number who actually survived to adolescence or adulthood may have been closer to 2 to 4. A common rough estimate would be around 3. So prehistoric reproduction was probably not the endless baby boom many people imagine. It was more like this. A few children were born, some were lost, and then the mother, the father, the grandmother, older siblings, and sometimes the entire camp worked together to keep the remaining children alive. That is the most counterintuitive part of this story. Prehistoric humans did not have modern birth control, but they also were not having 15 children in a lifetime. Because the real limit was not just desire, it was the body, food, breastfeeding, migration, disease, child mortality, and the prehistoric world itself. To understand this, we have to separate two questions. The first question is, how many children were born? The second question is, how many of those children actually grew up? In the modern world, those two numbers are usually not that far apart. A child is born, and then modern systems step in. Hospitals, vaccines, antibiotics, clean water, infant formula, emergency care, a whole safety net. But in the prehistoric world, birth only meant the child was alive for now. After that came checkpoint after checkpoint. Infection was one checkpoint. Diarrhea was one checkpoint. Cold was one checkpoint. Weaning was one checkpoint. Food shortage was one checkpoint. Accidents during migration were another. Today, a small cut, a fever, or a stomach infection might mean a doctor's visit, some medicine, and a few days of rest. In the prehistoric world, it could be the line between life and death. So the harshest part of prehistoric reproduction is this. The number of children born was not the same as the number of children who grew up. A mother might give birth to 5 or 6 children, but in the end, maybe only 3 would still be standing beside her. That is why we cannot use modern intuition to understand prehistoric birth rates. Today we ask, how many children did she have? But the prehistoric world asked a much harder question. How many children made it to the next generation? At this point, many people might still ask, if children died so often, why not simply have more? If 6 children gave you 3 survivors, wouldn't 12 children give you 6? That sounds like math. But prehistoric life was not math, and the human body was not a machine. A woman did not automatically have 1 child every year just because there was no modern birth control. In the prehistoric environment, the body had its own brakes. You can think of it as an ancient reproductive decision system. It kept checking 3 things. Is there enough energy? Is the previous child still completely dependent? Can this environment support 1 more child? If the answer to any of these was no, the next pregnancy might be delayed. The first brake was energy. Pregnancy is not easy. Childbirth is not easy. Breastfeeding is not easy. All of them require a huge amount of energy. But for hunter-gatherers, food was not as stable as it is for us today. Today, if you are hungry, you can order food, open the fridge, or walk into a supermarket. A prehistoric person had to search, dig, gather, track, and hunt. Fruit today did not mean fruit next month. Game in one season did not mean game in the next. When food was scarce, the body had a priority. Keep the mother alive. not start another pregnancy. That does not mean the body was broken. It means the body was trying to survive. The second break was breastfeeding. Prehistoric children were not breastfed for just a few months and then suddenly independent. In many hunter-gatherer settings, children were breastfed for a long time and often very frequently. Where the mother went, the child went. When the child was hungry, the child nursed. And long, frequent breastfeeding can affect ovulation. In simple terms, the body receives a signal. There is already a child who depends heavily on you. Your energy is still feeding this child. Do not rush into the next pregnancy. This is not perfect birth control. It is not modern contraception. But it can lengthen the gap between births. So a prehistoric woman did not necessarily give birth and then become pregnant again a few months later. In many cases, births may have been spaced 3 or even 4 years apart. That is completely different from the idea of one baby every year. The third break was migration, and this is the part people often miss. When we say children, it is easy to imagine numbers. Child 1, child 2, child 3. But in the prehistoric world, a child was not just a number. A child was weight. A baby cannot walk. A 2 or 3-year-old cannot walk very far. If the whole group had to move with the seasons, follow water, follow animals, and shift camp, the mother faced a very practical problem. One child in her arms, one child beside her, tools on her back, animal skins, food, and she still had to keep up with the group. If children were born too close together, the problem was not just one more mouth to feed. The whole survival system became heavier. Who carries the baby? Who carries the toddler? Who gathers food? Who watches the fire? Who protects the children? Who can run when danger appears? This is not a question of whether a mother loves her children enough. It is a physics problem. One person cannot carry 2 children who cannot move independently, plus tools, food, and everything else needed to survive. So in many hunter-gatherer environments, spacing children by several years may have been a survival strategy. Not because prehistoric mothers did not want more children, but because births that were too close together could put both the mother and the children in danger. So here is the first real answer. Prehistoric humans were not unable to reproduce, but pregnancy was repeatedly slowed down by energy, breastfeeding, and migration. Now we get to the harsher part. Even if a child was successfully born, held in the mother's arms, and fed with breast milk, that child was still far from safe. When we imagine prehistoric danger, we often picture mammoths, saber-toothed cats, cave bears, or some giant predator jumping out of the darkness. But for a child, the real dangers were often much less dramatic. An infection, a round of diarrhea, poor nutrition after weaning, cold, a small wound, a fever that lasted for days. In a world without antibiotics, vaccines, clean water, or modern emergency care, many problems that are manageable today could become deadly. This was especially true for babies and young children. Surviving the first month was a checkpoint. Surviving the first winter was a checkpoint. Moving from breast milk to other foods was a checkpoint. Learning to walk and keep up with migration was a checkpoint. Reaching adolescence was another checkpoint. One of the most dangerous and easily overlooked stages was weaning. As long as a child was nursing, breast milk provided at least some steady nutrition. But when the mother became pregnant again, or her milk supply decreased, the child had to start eating other foods. And then a new problem appeared. What adults can eat, children cannot always eat. Meat can be too tough. Roots and tubers can be too rough. Nuts and seeds often need processing. A newly weaned child needs food that is soft, reliable, and rich in energy. And in the wild, that kind of food is never cheap. This is where a very important figure enters the story: the grandmother. In discussions about human evolution, there is an idea called the grandmother hypothesis. It tries to explain a strange question. Why do human females often live for a long time after they stop having children? In many animals, once reproduction ends, the evolutionary value seems to drop. But humans are different. Older women, even after they no longer have children themselves, may still help their descendants survive. They can gather food, watch children, share knowledge. While a young mother is nursing a newborn, the grandmother may be near the camp, digging for tubers, collecting nuts, seeds, and wild fruits. These foods may not look as impressive as a large animal brought back from a hunt. There is no dramatic hero moment, no hunter walking into camp with a deer over his shoulders. But these foods can be steady. And when it comes to raising children, steady often matters more than spectacular. Imagine this scene. A newly weaned child is crying from hunger. His young mother is already holding another baby. Then an older woman, with gray hair and a bent back, digs a tuber out of the ground. She cleans it, prepares it, and gives it to the child. She is not having more children herself, but she is helping the next generation survive. That is why human children were not raised by a mother alone. Very often, they were raised by a small society. Fathers, grandmothers, older siblings, relatives, other people in the camp. At different moments, any of them could help pull a child back from the edge. This is one of the things that makes humans unusual. We are not the fastest breeding animal. We are one of the animals that invests the most in each child. A human baby is born helpless. It cannot walk. It cannot find food. It cannot protect itself. And human childhood is incredibly long. If one mother had to handle pregnancy, childbirth, breastfeeding, gathering, migration, defense, and multiple children entirely on her own, the burden would be enormous. So humans did not follow the strategy of have as many as possible and let many die. Our strategy was closer to this. Have children slowly. Raise them slowly. Raise them together. That is the core of prehistoric reproduction. It was not about who had the most children. It was about who could keep one more child alive. And over a long enough timescale, that difference becomes enormous. In one generation, one extra surviving child may not seem like much. But if that small advantage continues for thousands or tens of thousands of years, the result compounds. In discussions about Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, researchers often talk about population size, child survival, and social networks as possible factors that shape the fate of different human groups. Of course, the disappearance of Neanderthals was complex. Climate change may have mattered. Population size may have mattered. Interbreeding may have mattered. Resource competition may have mattered. But one thing is worth thinking about. Across evolutionary time, the future of a group is not always decided by who has the sharpest spear, or who has the strongest muscles. Sometimes, what changes history is much simpler. One more child survives in this generation. That child grows up. That child has children. And after hundreds of generations, the curves begin to separate. So when we ask how many children a prehistoric woman had, we are not just asking for a cold statistic. We are asking something deeper. How did our species pass through such a long shadow of death and still reach the present? The answer may not be as grand as we imagine. Not every step depended on heroes. Not every step depended on war. Not every step depended on invention. Sometimes, it was just one child surviving the winter. One mother lasting one more year. One grandmother finding a little more food. One group protecting one more toddler. And history moved forward by one small step. Then agriculture appeared, and human reproduction changed again. Farming and settled life changed many things. First, children did not always have to be carried across long distances. For hunter-gatherers, migration was a major pressure. But once humans began living near permanent villages, mothers did not have to carry children over long migration routes as often. The cost of childcare changed. Second, grains and porridge-like foods may have made earlier weaning easier. Once children were less dependent on breast milk, the mother's cycle and the possibility of another pregnancy could return sooner. Agricultural societies also needed labor. Family structure and ideas about wealth changed. A child was not only someone to care for. A child could become future labor. As a result, agricultural societies often had higher fertility than hunter-gatherer societies. But there is another twist. Agriculture did not necessarily make people healthier. Early farming could bring a less varied diet, more crowded settlements, diseases that spread more easily, harder labor, and stronger social inequality. In other words, agriculture may have made populations grow faster, but it did not necessarily make life easier for each individual. It was like adding an accelerator to human population growth. But that accelerator was not free. The move from hunting and gathering to farming was not a simple story of humans going from misery to happiness. It was a move from one kind of survival pressure to another. In hunter-gatherer life, children born too close together could slow migration and overwhelm the mother. In farming life, settlement and grain made more children possible. But disease, labor, nutrition, and social pressure became more complicated. So if we ask, why didn't prehistoric humans have 15 children in a lifetime? The answer is especially clear for hunter-gatherers. The body limited it, the environment limited it, and children were extremely difficult to raise. But after agriculture, the limits changed, and fertility could rise. That is why we have to separate different worlds: Paleolithic hunter-gatherers, Neolithic farmers, and later ancient societies. They were not all living in the same reproductive world. Now let's return to the original question. How many children did prehistoric humans have in a lifetime? If we are talking about Paleolithic hunter-gatherers, a reasonable estimate is this. A woman may have had around 5 to 6 children over her lifetime, but only 2 to 4 may have survived to adolescence or adulthood. A rough common estimate would be around 3. Of course, this does not mean every prehistoric woman was the same. Different regions, climates, food sources, migration patterns, and disease environments could change the numbers. And we do not have birth records from 30,000 years ago. There was no prehistoric census. No one carved a neat table into a cave wall saying, "This year, this many children were born, this many children died." So these numbers have to be inferred from archaeology, anthropology, and comparisons with more recent hunter-gatherer groups. They are not exact down to the last child, but they are enough to break a common myth. No modern birth control did not mean endless births. High child mortality did not mean the solution was simply to have more children. Because every child, from birth to adulthood, required the mother's body, the group's food, many people's time, and a little bit of luck. We are here today not because all of our ancestors had huge numbers of children. We are here because, generation after generation, a few children survived the most dangerous years of life. They survived the cold. They survived hunger. They survived infection. They survived weaning. They survived accidents on the migration route. Then they grew up and passed life to the next generation. So if you want the answer in numbers, a prehistoric hunter-gatherer woman may have had around 5 to 6 children, and maybe 2 to 4 survived to grow up. But if you want the meaning in one sentence, humans did not make it this far by simply having endless babies. We made it this far because mothers, fathers, grandmothers, siblings, and entire groups kept a small number of children alive in a world with no modern safety net. Every cell in your body comes from those children who survived, and from the people behind them who fought to keep them alive. That is what makes prehistoric reproduction so brutal and so deeply human.